Section 1. Karen's unexpected arrival at the lake the morning sun had barely reflected off the calm waters of Silver Pine Lake when I noticed the unmistakable figure of Karen Thompson, the notorious HOA enforcer, striding purposefully along the gravel path leading from the parking area to the docks. Her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and her phone in the other, as though she had already begun cataloging every perceived violation she might encounter. Her presence immediately transforming the serene lakeside into a stage of tension and foreboding that threatened to shatter the tranquility I had come to expect from weekends spent at my boat. I had spent weeks preparing for this particular retreat, ensuring that my boat, dock, and all surrounding areas were compliant with every conceivable regulation, yet Karen, as usual, appeared unconcerned with facts, permits, or reason, her mind already consumed with imagined infractions, punitive fines, and the satisfaction of asserting control over a space where she had no legitimate authority, her eyes scanning the shoreline as if each ripple on the water could somehow reflect disobedience, each dock plank a silent testament to the possibility of a rule broken. She approached with that calculated confidence I had come to dread, her heels crunching against gravel with deliberate intent, and without so much as a greeting, launched into her familiar monologue about HOA regulations, property rights, and lake access rules, her tone sharp, clipped, and suffused with an arrogance that had long characterized her interactions with neighbors, particularly those who refused to bow to her whims. I stepped forward calmly, coffee in hand, fully aware that her usual combination of intimidation, selective enforcement, and relentless scrutiny had ruined countless mornings for less prepared residents, and yet I had the documentation, the legal permits, and the prior assurance of the sheriff that I was in full compliance, a fact that she would attempt to dismiss, misrepresent, or ignore in service of her personal vendetta. Her gaze fell upon the boat, which gleamed under the rising sun, its hull polished and lines immaculate, and I could sense her internal calculation of how best to threaten, manipulate, or coerce, as if simply staring at the object could conjure legal authority, and as she pointed to it with her clipboard, declaring that it constituted unauthorized watercraft use, and that I could face immediate fines or be banned from the lake, I suppressed a sigh, knowing that her interpretation of the rules was as elastic as her ego and equally divorced from reality. I calmly reminded her that all registration, safety inspections, and HOA notifications had been submitted months in advance, and that the sheriff's office had previously confirmed my right to use the lake without interference, but Karen waved my words away, insisting that new policies and board amendments somehow superseded all prior approvals, as though recent revisions existed solely to provide her with the satisfaction of harassment, her voice rising with each assertion, her gestures growing sharper and more theatrical, demanding compliance in a manner that blended obsession, self-importance, and the illusion of legality into a performance designed to intimidate. Her approach was deliberate, pacing along the dock, taking notes on minor imperfections, photographing the waterline, and muttering about hazards, violations, and potential fines, all while ignoring the evidence of compliance I had patiently prepared: registrations, permits, correspondence, and documented inspections that collectively demonstrated my adherence to all applicable laws and HOA rules. The tension escalated as Karen attempted to summon reinforcements from the HOA, typing frantically on her phone, sending messages laden with exaggerations and false claims, a transparent effort to manufacture authority through the illusion of institutional support. Yet, unbeknownst to her, the neighborhood was fully aware of her history of overreach, and any attempt to act without verified legal standing would quickly be documented and challenged. The air was thick with anticipation and quiet defiance, the water shimmering peacefully in contrast to the storm of obsession that Karen carried in every word, glance, and gesture, and I knew that any misstep on my part could be spun as provocation, but retreat was unnecessary as I had both evidence and the implicit assurance of the sheriff's office to counter her habitual intimidation. As her tirade continued, her frustration became more palpable, each repeated demand, each exaggerated claim, each threatening gesture revealing her desperation and obsession with control, her carefully curated image of authority now undermined by the consistent facts of law and compliance. The lake itself seemed indifferent to her presence, reflecting the sky and the surrounding trees with tranquil perfection, a stark contrast to the storm of her emotions, and neighbors passing on adjacent docks watched from a distance, noting the familiar pattern of Karen's obsessive scrutiny, the theatricality of her complaints, and the unshakable calm with which I maintained my position, evidence in hand, prepared to counter any attempt at harassment. For hours, she paced, documented, and insisted, attempting to manufacture chaos from compliance, striving to create a sense of urgency, fear, or obligation where none existed. But each action was meticulously noted, photographed, and archived, ensuring that every potential overreach would have immediate and undeniable evidence ready for legal or administrative review. Even her attempts at intimidation, raising her voice, pointing at minor imperfections, and invoking obscure bylaws, fell flat against the backdrop of documented legality, prior approvals, and the calm assurance that she could not act outside her bounds without consequences. It was then, in the midst of her relentless campaign, that the first sign of resolution arrived. The familiar rumble of a sheriff's vehicle on the gravel road leading to the dock, the flashing lights reflecting off the water and instantly commanding Karen's attention. She froze mid-sentence, her clipboard lowering slightly, her face betraying the first real signs of apprehension, and the officers emerged with measured authority, their presence both professional and unambiguous. Karen's habitual tactics of intimidation were no longer effective, and any attempt to enforce her self-perceived authority would be met with immediate legal consequences. The sheriff approached calmly, confirming that all registrations, permits, and safety inspections were in order, that my use of the lake was fully compliant, and that Karen's attempts to restrict access were without legal standing. Karen's face paled as she attempted to interject, waving her clipboard and muttering about emergency amendments or special rules, but the officer's steady gaze and firm instructions left no room for debate. She was to step back, leave the property, and cease all further interference, and any violation of this order would result in immediate action. For the first time, Karen's confidence faltered, her habitual overreach confronted by the immovable force of law and the unambiguous clarity of documented compliance, and the tension that had dominated the morning finally shifted as I felt a profound sense of relief and vindication, knowing that not only had my rights been reaffirmed, but that her obsession had been neutralized by evidence, authority, and procedure. The sheriff remained briefly, ensuring the situation had stabilized, and Karen, realizing that her campaign of intimidation had been thwarted, retreated down the path she had marched along so boldly, muttering threats that had lost all power in the presence of law. The lake returned to its tranquil rhythm, the water reflecting the rising sun and the surrounding pines in perfect serenity, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe freely, knowing that the combination of preparation, legal compliance, and the sheriff's decisive presence had transformed a potential confrontation into a clear and unambiguous affirmation of property rights, personal agency, and the ultimate futility of obsessive, arbitrary authority when confronted with law, evidence, and the calm resilience of those who refuse to yield to intimidation. Section 2, Karen's escalating harassment and neighborhood vigilance. After her humiliating retreat from the lake that morning, Karen Thompson's obsession with asserting control over my boat and waterfront property did not wane. Instead, it intensified in a way that bordered on compulsive mania, her every thought consumed by the perceived injustice of being denied authority, and her mind spinning through increasingly elaborate schemes to regain the power she had lost despite repeated legal reminders and the visible presence of the sheriff who had effectively neutralized her initial attempts. She began her day earlier, often pacing the neighborhood before dawn, consulting outdated HOA manuals, municipal ordinances, and her own scribbled notes, convinced that somewhere hidden within the small print was a loophole that would justify an immediate ban of my boat from the lake. Her obsession manifested in frequent visits to nearby residents, attempting to solicit support for her claims, misrepresenting my compliance, and spinning tales of alleged violations with a fervor that, to those who had lived through her habitual overreach, was both predictable and almost comically desperate. She knocked on doors repeatedly, handed out printed evidence of supposed infractions, and sent a torrent of emails and texts to the HOA board, each laden with exaggeration, selective truth, and unsubstantiated claims. all while ignoring the solid documentation of permits, registrations, and approvals that had already been verified by the sheriff's office, leaving her arguments both legally and factually void. Karen's increasingly erratic behavior drew attention not only from neighbors, but also from other local authorities, who were made aware of her repeated attempts to intimidate compliant residents, and this network of vigilance created a situation in which every move she made was observed, recorded, and countered, effectively removing the power that her obsession had once afforded her, and turning her once commanding presence into a figure of desperate isolation. Her next attempts involved direct intimidation at the lake, where she would arrive mid-morning, inspecting docks, measuring distances, taking photographs of minor debris or natural variations, and making loud proclamations about violations, fines, and the supposed authority granted to her by the HOA, all in a futile attempt to manufacture fear. Yet each time I was prepared, evidence in hand, my documentation precise and complete, demonstrating full compliance with every rule and regulation, leaving her increasingly frustrated, her voice rising with each shouted claim, her gestures becoming more frantic, and her confidence visibly eroding in the presence of both law enforcement and vigilant neighbors who observed from nearby cabins and dock areas. She attempted psychological tactics as well, leaving notes on my vehicle, posting vague warnings on community bulletin boards, and making repeated calls to the HOA board in hopes of creating a sense of urgency and compliance. Yet the board, now fully aware of her history and her obsessive tendencies, responded with measured statements, dismissing unsubstantiated claims, reinforcing that all actions must be evidence-based, and warning that continued harassment could result in personal liability, effectively closing every avenue Karen had hoped to exploit. The neighborhood, emboldened by the sheriff's presence and the clarity of the documented compliance, began to act collectively, monitoring Karen's movements and providing mutual support, a network of observation and communication that ensured any attempt at harassment would be immediately noticed and recorded. Neighbors exchanged notes, photographs, and witness statements, quietly observing Karen's escalating obsession and preparing for any future encounters without the need for confrontation, ensuring that she had no avenue through which to instill fear or assert authority, and transforming what could have been a stressful and isolating situation into a display of community resilience and empowerment. Karen, blinded by her obsession, misinterpreted the calm coordination of the neighborhood as weakness or indecision and redoubled her efforts, showing up at the dock during irregular hours, pacing the shoreline, taking notes on minor imperfections, and shouting about violations and fines. Yet each encounter was met with calm documentation, respectful distance, and in some cases, direct intervention by the sheriff, leaving her actions legally impotent. Each escalation by Karen further exposed her obsession and instability, and her attempts to rally support through misinformation only deepened her isolation. Residents who might have once hesitated to challenge her were now emboldened by the clear display of law enforcement oversight and her repeated failures, and they actively shared updates and documentation to ensure that the community remained unified against her tactics. She even tried to fabricate new rules by citing obscure or misinterpreted HOA clauses, claiming they applied retroactively to my boat. But every claim was countered by clear evidence of compliance, prior approvals, and legal guidance, leaving her increasingly frantic and ineffective, while neighbors documented her movements and communications, reinforcing the boundaries that her obsession could not cross. The tension reached a peak when Karen, convinced that intimidation from a distance was insufficient, attempted a direct confrontation, walking onto the dock while muttering about emergency enforcement powers and unauthorized watercraft, only to be met by the calm but firm presence of the sheriff, who immediately instructed her to step back and cease all contact, reinforcing the message that her obsession had no legal foundation and that any further attempts could result in immediate action. Her face turned pale, her hands shook, and her muttered threats lost all power in the presence of law and community vigilance, marking the culmination of her increasingly desperate campaign and the unmistakable shift of control from her obsessive hands into the structured and undeniable authority of law enforcement and collective neighborhood action. By the end of this relentless escalation, Karen's obsession had become transparent, her methods exposed, and her influence effectively nullified. The neighborhood had not only protected the lake and my boat, but had also transformed fear into empowerment, observation into action, and potential harassment into documented accountability, demonstrating that obsessive control, no matter how persistent, can be neutralized when evidence, law, and communal solidarity converge, and the lake itself, once a stage for confrontation, returned to its peaceful rhythm, reflecting sunlight and serenity over the docks and boats, a quiet testament to resilience, preparation, and the ultimate triumph of legal clarity over obsessive ambition. Section 3. Karen's final escalation and the sheriff's stand as the days passed following her repeated failures to assert authority over my boat at Silver Pine Lake. Karen Thompson's obsession intensified to a level that was nearly unrecognizable, her thoughts consumed entirely by the idea of forcing compliance, punishing perceived infractions, and regaining the power she believed was her due. Despite the clear, documented legality of my waterfront activities and the consistent oversight of law enforcement, who had firmly established that her threats carried no authority, she spent hours at her home, poring over HOA covenants, municipal codes, and old meeting minutes, cross-referencing every clause she could find in an obsessive effort to construct a legal basis for banning my boat from the lake, and yet every document she cited was either irrelevant, misinterpreted, or legally insufficient, leaving her plans fundamentally flawed, even in her own mind. Her frustration and desperation manifested in multiple daily visits to the dock, clipboard in hand, camera poised, and her voice loud with proclamations of fines, violations, and unauthorized use, as if repetition could create legitimacy where none existed. She paced the shoreline, measured distances, photographed minor imperfections, and made exaggerated notes, muttering constantly about regulations, amendments, and emergency powers, her energy frantic and unrelenting, a visible reflection of the obsession that had taken over her every thought and action. Despite her theatrics, I remained calm and composed, fully prepared with all permits, registrations, and prior approvals, aware that her arguments were baseless and that the presence of the sheriff and the watchful eyes of neighbors ensured that any attempt at harassment would be immediately documented and countered. Karen escalated further by attempting to rally support from other residents, sending a barrage of emails, posting notices on neighborhood forums, and visiting neighbors in person to claim that my compliance was fraudulent or insufficient, painting herself as the lone enforcer of rules in a community supposedly ignoring regulations. However, neighbors, now fully aware of her obsessive patterns and the clear legality of my situation, politely but firmly rejected her claims, often sharing updates with each other and alerting the sheriff's office, creating a network of vigilance that left Karen isolated and increasingly frantic, her attempts to manipulate perception completely ineffective. Every misstep she made, from exaggerating minor details to invoking outdated rules, was carefully documented by both myself and the sheriff, reinforcing the evidence that her actions were not only obsessive, but also increasingly aggressive and potentially actionable as harassment. Her once commanding presence was replaced by visible desperation, her movements jittery, her gestures exaggerated, and her attempts at intimidation transparent, exposing the futility of obsession when confronted by clear legality and coordinated community resistance. The culmination of her escalation occurred one late afternoon when Karen attempted what she perceived as her final decisive intervention. She strode to the dock with the intention of physically preventing me from launching the boat, muttering about emergency HOA powers, alleged violations, and fines, fully convinced that surprise, intimidation, and persistence would bend the situation in her favor. However, she had not anticipated the sheriff's preemptive arrival, coordinated with neighborhood watch reports and prior documentation of her escalating behavior. As she approached, officers stepped firmly between her and the boat, clearly instructing her to step back and cease all contact, their tone calm but authoritative, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Karen protested, waving her clipboard, shouting about supposed emergency rules, and attempting to manipulate witnesses, yet every argument was met with the unyielding clarity of law. Her actions were harassment, she had no authority to restrict access, and any further interference would result in immediate legal consequences. Her face turned pale, hands shook, and her voice faltered, revealing the depth of obsession and desperation that had consumed her for weeks. while the calm yet firm presence of law enforcement underscored the futility of her campaign and the clear victory of documented compliance over arbitrary intimidation. Neighbors watched from a safe distance, some recording video and taking notes, silently reinforcing the unbreakable barrier of community oversight that Karen could not penetrate. Her attempts to intimidate were countered at every step, each threat rendered impotent by the combination of evidence, law enforcement, and neighborhood vigilance. The sheriff's intervention not only neutralized her immediate threat, but also sent a clear message that obsessive enforcement without legal foundation carried consequences, and that the collective observation of the community could effectively protect individual rights and property. Karen's retreat was hesitant, muttered threats trailing behind her like smoke, her posture slumped, an aura of authority completely shattered, as it became clear to all observers that her obsession had reached the limits of its efficacy and that the law, combined with organized vigilance, had decisively restored control to the rightful parties. In the aftermath of this escalation, the lake returned to its natural tranquility, the water reflecting sunlight and the surrounding pines, while Karen's obsession had been thoroughly neutralized. Her attempts to manipulate, intimidate, or fabricate authority were rendered completely ineffective by the careful documentation, the calm adherence to legal standards, and the watchful eyes of a community united against harassment. The sheriff remained on site briefly, ensuring stability, reinforcing the limits of Karen's authority, and providing reassurance that any further attempts at interference would result in immediate legal action. Residents, previously silent witnesses to her obsessive patterns, now felt empowered, sharing their observations and reinforcing the clear boundaries that had been established. Karen Thompson, once a figure of intimidating authority, had become a cautionary example of obsessive overreach. Her influence nullified, her tactics exposed, and her campaign of intimidation conclusively countered by law, evidence, and communal vigilance. The boat, dock, and waterfront remained fully within legal compliance and personal control, a symbol of resilience and the ultimate triumph of preparation, documentation, and the unwavering presence of law enforcement over arbitrary obsession. By the end of this period, Karen's final escalation had served not to intimidate, but to expose her obsession and the limits of her power. The sheriff's firm stance, the neighborhood's coordination, and the clear legal documentation had ensured that every step she took was countered, every claim dismantled, and every threat rendered powerless, leaving the lake peaceful once more and transforming what could have been a protracted confrontation into a story of justice, resilience, and the triumph of law and community over obsessive authority. The sun set over Silver Pine Lake, the water shimmering with the promise of calm and order restored, and Karen's retreat marked the symbolic end of her campaign, leaving a community united, empowered, and secure, while her obsessive attempts faded into irrelevance under the clear light of accountability, law, and neighborhood solidarity. Section 4. Karen arrives and faces the unexpected. The moment Karen had been waiting for arrived with the precision of her own obsessive planning. She appeared at the edge of the clearing with her clipboard clutched tightly, measuring tape swinging from her wrist, eyes sharp with the calculated intensity of someone who believed she was about to assert control over a situation that, in her mind, demanded her dominance, and as she stepped onto the cabin property, she moved with the assuredness of a predator surveying what she imagined to be her prey, scanning every detail of the porch, the roof line, the deck, and the surrounding forest with a critical eye, muttering under her breath about potential violations and noncompliance, ready to unleash a tirade of corrections, warnings, and threats that she had rehearsed meticulously in her mind for days. Yet even as she took her first steps across the clearing, there was an undeniable tension in the air, a sense that the stage was set, not only for confrontation but for a dramatic reversal, a twist of fate that would expose the limits of her obsession and the vulnerabilities she had failed to anticipate, and she was utterly unprepared for the presence that suddenly arrived, the sound of authoritative footsteps behind her, the crisp, commanding voice that cut through the forest like a blade, and the unmistakable weight of federal authority making itself known in the most unexpected and profound way. Before Karen could issue her first accusatory comment or launch into a rehearsed critique, the unmistakable figures of federal agents emerged from the trees, clad in tactical vests, badges gleaming, eyes sharp and focused, and the air seemed to crackle with tension as their presence immediately shifted the dynamics of power on the clearing, transforming the confrontation from a petty, bureaucratic spat into a serious, high stakes encounter, and Karen froze, her carefully constructed confidence, faltering as the gravity of the moment settled over her, her face paling as her eyes darted from the cabin to the approaching agents, realizing too late that the authority she had so confidently wielded was dwarfed by a force far greater than any HOA regulation or personal vendetta, and that the entire narrative she had crafted of her righteous oversight and moral superiority was suddenly and utterly irrelevant in the face of law enforcement with jurisdiction, training, and the unquestionable authority to intervene in matters far beyond her obsession. The agents moved methodically, professional yet calm, scanning the perimeter, assessing the property, and issuing commands that were clear, decisive, and authoritative, their presence immediately silencing any murmurs from the nearby trees, the faint rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds, as if nature itself recognized the shift in power, and Karen, previously the orchestrator of drama, now became a figure of frozen panic, unsure how to respond, what to say, or which authority she could appeal to in a situation she had never anticipated, her clipboard lowering slightly, hands trembling, mouth opening to speak, but yielding no words as the agent's presence alone communicated that her obsessive scrutiny, her threats, and her carefully rehearsed domination held no weight here, that her vendetta had been elevated to a level far beyond her imagination, and that the very people who had arrived were there to ensure that the cabin, its inhabitants, and the surrounding property were protected from interference, harassment, or intimidation, a scenario she could neither manipulate nor control. As she attempted to regain composure, stepping forward with clipped, rehearsed commands, the lead agent turned to her with a calm, measured tone, the kind that brooked no argument yet carried no malice, stating simply but firmly that any attempts at harassment, intimidation, or unauthorized inspection would not be tolerated, that the cabin and its occupants were legally compliant and protected, and that her actions would be monitored for potential violations of law, immediately shattering the illusion of authority she had cultivated over weeks of obsessive planning, and as the word sank in, her lips quivered, her face turned an ashen white, and the magnitude of public exposure, combined with the undeniable presence of federal power, overwhelmed her, leaving her fumbling with her notes, muttering incoherently about inspections, violations, and community standards that suddenly seemed meaningless in the shadow of real authority, while we, standing on the porch of our cabin, watched, in quiet disbelief and relief, our anticipation of confrontation replaced with a mix of astonishment, vindication, and adrenaline, recognizing that the moment we had dreaded had transformed into an unanticipated triumph, as her obsession collided with forces she had never imagined, and she was utterly powerless to manipulate, intimidate, or control the unfolding reality. The presence of the federal agents was not merely a deterrent, it was a dramatic revelation, a turning point that exposed the fragility of Karen's obsession, and the crowd of neighbors who had gathered discreetly to witness the events, sensing tension in the air, now recognized the absurdity of her overreach, watching as her carefully constructed persona of authority dissolved under the weight of legal and procedural power, and as the agents began to perform their assessment, their calm efficiency only further highlighting the contrast between reasoned law enforcement and obsessive bureaucratic tyranny, while Karen, for all her previous assertiveness, shrank visibly, her voice reduced to frantic muttering, her gestures disjointed and ineffective, and the dynamic of the clearing shifted entirely, a once unquestioned arbiter of neighborhood compliance, rendered helpless in the face of legitimate authority, her obsession laid bare for all to see, and the psychological shift was profound, a mixture of shock, humiliation, and the sudden awareness that her vendetta, no matter how meticulously planned, had been entirely eclipsed by forces far greater than her own obsessive imagination, and in that instant the balance of power had irrevocably shifted, leaving Karen pale, stunned, and utterly unprepared for the dramatic and unforgettable events that were about to unfold. Section 5, Karen's ultimate downfall, and the lake restored in the aftermath of weeks of escalating obsession, threats, and harassment. Karen Thompson's campaign against my lawful use of Silver Pine Lake reached its inevitable conclusion. Her desperate attempts at intimidation, rendered utterly impotent by the combination of law enforcement oversight, meticulous documentation of compliance, and the unwavering solidarity of a neighborhood, a coalition of residents who had watched her obsessive behavior grow from mere nuisance into a serious campaign of harassment, and were now fully empowered to ensure that justice prevailed. Each step she had taken, from pacing the docks and photographing minor imperfections to circulating exaggerated claims to neighbors and the HOA board, had been recorded, cataloged, and countered with irrefutable evidence, creating a dossier so comprehensive that any further attempt at enforcement on her part would not only fail, but expose her to significant legal liability. Karen's obsession, which had previously given her a sense of authority and control, had been methodically neutralized, and in the quiet aftermath, her once commanding presence was reduced to furtive glances from the edges of the property, muttered complaints, and the faint but unmistakable tremor of frustration in her gestures, a visible testament to how obsession, when untempered by law or fact, can lead only to exposure and defeat. The neighborhood itself, having endured the tension and stress of her relentless harassment, emerged stronger, more cohesive, and remarkably resilient, having learned through observation, coordination, and documentation how to counter obsession with transparency, preparation, and collective action. Neighbors shared updates, witness statements, and photographic evidence, coordinated with the sheriff's office, and maintained a network of vigilance that ensured any attempt at intimidation would be immediately addressed, creating a social and legal infrastructure that protected both individual rights and community integrity. Children played freely along the shoreline. Families navigated docks without fear, and the once tense atmosphere of Silver Pine Lake returned to its serene rhythm, reflecting sunlight and the surrounding pines, a visual metaphor for the restored order and the triumph of law and solidarity over arbitrary, obsessive authority. Karen, observing from a distance, could do nothing to reverse the reality that her campaign had failed at every level. The sheriff had reinforced legal boundaries, the HOA had declined to act on her exaggerated claims, and the community had firmly reclaimed control, leaving her isolated, frustrated, and exposed. The climax of this resolution came when the sheriff, having monitored Karen's repeated attempts at escalation, issued a clear and unambiguous warning that any further harassment, trespass, or interference with my property and activities at the lake would result in immediate legal consequences, including fines and potential criminal charges. Karen's attempts to argue, protest, or manipulate were met with unwavering authority and a calm explanation of her legal limits, demonstrating the decisive power of law when applied consistently and highlighting that her obsession, no matter how persistent, could not overcome clear documentation, preparation, and the structured enforcement of rules. Her gestures grew desperate, muttered threats lost all credibility, and for the first time, the obsessive energy that had fueled her campaign appeared futile, her aura of control shattered by the unyielding presence of law and the collective vigilance of a united community, leaving her retreating, defeated, and visibly humiliated in the wake of her failure. In the days that followed, the lake returned fully to its natural calm, my boat remained docked and ready for use, and the neighborhood celebrated the restoration of order and personal rights, a quiet yet profound acknowledgement that preparation, documentation, and solidarity could overcome even the most persistent and irrational attempts at harassment. The community had not only protected one individual's property and leisure, but had also reinforced the principle that obsession and arbitrary authority cannot override law, evidence, and collective vigilance. Karen Thompson's pattern of harassment, once a source of anxiety and disruption, was now fully documented and constrained. Her influence evaporated, her obsessive campaign conclusively neutralized, and her role transformed from feared enforcer to cautionary example, illustrating the consequences of unchecked obsession when confronted by preparation, law, and communal solidarity. The final moments of the saga saw Karen retreat entirely from the lake, muttering in frustration, her previous threats and proclamations now meaningless as the sheriff, neighbors, and HOA oversight ensured that any attempt to resume her campaign would be met with immediate decisive action. Her obsession, once a source of intimidation and disruption, had reached its natural conclusion, leaving the community secure, empowered, and united, and the lake itself calm, serene, and fully restored to the peaceful rhythm it had held before her intrusion. The sun glinted off the water, reflecting the pines and distant hills, a quiet testament to resilience, law, and the triumph of preparation and solidarity over obsessive control, while neighbors exchanged smiles, reassurance, and shared pride, knowing that even the most determined attempts at harassment could be countered when law, evidence, and community vigilance worked together to uphold justice, rights, and peace. Karen Thompson, once an imposing and obsessive presence, had been decisively thwarted, her authority nullified, and her obsession exposed as powerless, leaving a lasting lesson in the value of preparation, collective action, and the unwavering application of law in the face of irrational control, ensuring that Silver Pine Lake, its boats, and its residents would remain safe, secure, and free from harassment, the calm water reflecting not only sunlight, but the quiet satisfaction of victory, justice, and restored tranquility.